Good morning. Thank you for joining us this morning. I'm Maria Rita Rago, and together with the rest of my colleagues, will be coordinating this meeting, sponsored by CAPSA. CAPSA is the Committee of Scientific Activities and Practice of the International Psychoanalytic Society in the framework of interregional exchange. On this occasion, the board directing community and the scientific secretariat of the Buenos Aires Psychoanalytic Association. Today, we are very happy and we are very proud to welcome in this meeting Lesley Caldwell, a psychoanalyst, a remarkable psychoanalyst from London, will be presenting her work, The Silent Patient. We have with us today Dr. Virginia Ungar, President of the International Psychoanalytic Association, Carmen Crespo, President of the Psychoanalytic Association of Buenos Aires, and Dr. Nemirovsky, Scientific Secretary of the Psychoanalytic Association of Buenos Aires. They will be introducing our guest speaker. Then Lesley Caldwell will be commented by Dr. Alfredo Painceira and Monica Cardenal, members, remarkable members of this association. Very briefly, I'd like to tell you the organization, the agenda. Dr. Caldwell will be presenting on 3 occasions, so there will be 2 meetings, 2 breaks, so that the commentators can make their comments. Then there will be some exchange of opinions, and finally we will have time for Q&A from the participants. We please ask you to write the questions in the chat that's available on the screen, and you can do so from the very beginning of this conference. Dr. Eliana Montuori will be choosing the questions for the Q&A. We have enough time to enjoy this meeting. To start then, I'll give the floor to Virginia. Please, Virginia, the floor is yours. Virginia Ungar. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here with all of you today. Those of you who are here in the Zoom meeting and all the rest of the people who are listening to us. I know there's many people out there to welcome our dear Lesley. Of course, I would very much like you to be here in Buenos Aires. Well, that was the original plan, Lesley, last year, so that you could have a chance to meet our offices. And definitely we would invite you to share lunch and dinner and to tour our beautiful city. This, of course, will happen in the future, no doubt, when this very difficult situation we're going through around the country at some point in time will finally come to an end. I'm very happy that we can work jointly thanks to technology. This is what we have available today, to be all together thinking about psychoanalytic topics. Just one thing I would like to share with you all. We met Lesley a long time ago, but in January 2019, we met in Basel, Switzerland, at a meeting where we both made presentations, and then we shared coffee and lunch and dinner. And well, very shyly, I asked her if she would like to come to Buenos Aires, of course, as a guest. And very quickly she said, yes, of course. Well, this has come true today, and we have Lesley with us today. And we are very happy to welcome you, Lesley, to listen to your fantastic investigation, where you can see your very sensitive clinical approach with theoretical important considerations. And she even dares to question concepts that can be considered classical today in psychoanalysis. Thank you very much, Lesley, and thank you all. And I would like to thank my society, UDEVA, for organizing with so much effort this meeting. Thank you, Virginia. Carmen Crespo, the floor is yours. Well, about a year ago, we were with the executive board in Abreva, very happy, preparing and talking about Lady Lesley Caldwell's visit to Buenos Aires. We were thinking and we were making projects. We were thinking about the meeting and also we were thinking about the supervisions, the exchanges we would have with other societies in Buenos Aires. On the other hand, we were thinking about other things as well. For example, how to tour Buenos Aires with Lesley, how to take her around and visit the city, how to look for a very nice hotel where she could be comfortable, look for a nice restaurant. And we had even imagined about a boat tour in Tigre. All of a sudden, all these worlds in less than 15 days, well, everything changed completely. Suddenly, the borders were closed, flights were canceled, and this project to have Lesley Caldwell with us, well, was an impossible project in the near future. However, well, the way we establish our relationships changed. And so this is very quickly we have all this new technology available. We're not yet in a position as to foresee what will happen, but thanks to this virtual reality, Lesley is today with us and reaching a very large audience, much larger than if she had been here in Buenos Aires with these very intimate and close meetings. But this is very moving to me as a chairperson of APEVA, this association, and on behalf of all the colleagues in the institution, I would like to welcome you, Lesley. There will be no restaurants, no hotel, no boat tour in Tigre, but we will have the pleasure to listen to you, the pleasure to have a conversation with you, to discuss with you, and then check once again that all the events that had made this meeting impossible were not enough to prevent our discussions in psychoanalysis and to grow in that sense, professionally speaking. Also, it's true that many situations have changed in this period of time. Also, some ways to approach our patients. However, we have to think that there are other things that have not changed. So these are the values that make our task and our identity as psychoanalysts. After reading the paper that Lesley suggested for this meeting, we found an analyst, an honest analyst who openly proposes her theory, her clinical approach, and also the experience of our own limits, and it's an opening to emotions. Lesley also tells us about something that makes to the quality of analysis, and that's the capacity of reception by the analyst that can hold and the patient in spite of all these questions related to transfer and countertransference. The capacity to ask yourself, to think about certainties and go inside your mind and the relationship with the patient is one of the possibilities the analyst has that should always be present. That's the capacity to tolerate and put up with uncertainty. These are qualities that Lesley describes and that are conditions that cannot be absent in our practice. When we had to choose between the two papers that Lesley had suggested for the face-to-face meeting, we chose The Silent Patient. And we chose that paper because it's a very clinical paper with a lot of shades, let's say, that can lead to conversations and dialogue and discussion, thinking about different theories and different approaches. Well, as always, I would like to thank CAPSA for this opportunity, for this exchange, including different regions of the IPA. Welcome, Lesley. Thank you, Carmen. Let's give the floor to Carlos Nemirovsky. Well, once again, welcome, Lesley. And you are one of the editors of the complete works of Winnicott, the complete works of Winnicott. And this visit coincides with a new and very careful translation of the first volume of the complete works of this author who makes this association Winnicott Chile. It includes 12 volumes and the first one has just come out. Well, of the very important curriculum of Lesley, I would like to point out 3 points that have to do with the background of any analyst, any colleague. She was the coordinator of an interdisciplinary program for 6 years. On the other hand, she was a member of the movie or cinema and psychoanalysis committee, and she has enormously contributed to the cultural closeness between Great Britain and other countries. In this sense, Lesley is a model of an analyst open to the world and to exchange. So I would like to emphasize that it's not just the training, the background. We also need to be open to the culture of the world, diversity, and art, as she shows in her experience. Thank you. Thank you, Carlos. And now, let's give the floor to Lesley to start her presentation. Lesley, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rita, and thank you also to, excuse me, to Virginia, to Carmen, and to Carlos for their warm welcome. I am very, very pleased to be with you. I am very sorry not to be in Buenos Aires. However, it is good. One indirect advantage of the last terrible year for us all has been that we can have many more international connections because we can do it from our own homes. So in some way, there has been something very fertile, I think, about the international exchanges that we have all been able to engage in. So I'm missing Buenos Aires, but glad to be here with you all from North London. So my paper is entitled Analytic Communication and Analytic Receptivity with the Silent Patient. And in this paper, I want to discuss this question of silent patients and silent sessions as part of thinking about analytic communication more generally. But my general interest in silence was in a much more positive and facilitating situation of the sharing of silence with my own analyst. And then by Winnicott's paper on communicating and not communicating, where he insists on the right of a patient not to communicate. I think this is a particularly interesting dilemma for the analyst, because if we regard everything the patient does as part of the analytic exchange, something over and above a non-communication based in words is surely also in play. And that is inevitably conveyed by the consistently silent patient. The attentive analyst is aware of this without necessarily being aware of what this is or may be. Psychoanalysis draws upon a range of communicative forms that gradually become established in each analysis. For me, they mostly do so actively, even when the idea is of acceptance and receptivity, of holding and containing. The extent to which these forms are capable of change through the ongoing work in the transference countertransference dynamic seems closely related to a continuing flexibility in both members of the analytic couple in encountering the other in the temporality of each session and over the temporality, the time of the analysis. In the three essays, Freud discusses sexuality in terms of active and passive, but the drive itself, as we know, is always active. I think this also provides the model of the session that is attended, whether it's silent or whether there are verbal exchanges or not, and regardless of the patient's conscious aims or what we might infer of them. Like verbal exchanges, different forms of silence that arise at different periods in an analysis are part of this ongoing process, either contributing to taking the analytic couple forward or to keeping them in one place. And that place may be a benign or perhaps neutral kind of a place, or it may represent a place where the couple are stuck and at odds, at loggerheads with each other, a potentially malignant transference situation. Whichever it may be in any particular session or over time, the analyst must remain open to the patient's state of mind, with all the added difficulties of accessing this in a predominantly silent treatment. But it also depends on the patient being able to make use of the analyst's active receptivity, and there may be many reasons for this not being possible. That is, there may be an incapacity in the patient that the analyst may not be able to approach in such a way as to shift something. Equally, there may be an incapacity in the analyst. All the Oxford English Dictionary's synonyms for communication, relate, connect, make contact, bridge, successfully conveying or sharing of ideas and feelings, take an active form and an idea of doing something. This is no less so for silence, which gains its significance not only from a protagonist's not saying anything, but from how the alternation of words and silence is always central to communication. Now, I'm going to just pick out a few people who have written and approached the question of silence from different perspectives out of a very large literature. Ella Sharp, writing in 1940, argues for the bodily foundation of words in the acquisition of language. For her, metaphor can only evolve in language when the bodily orifices become controlled in some way, and the emotions accompanying certain bodily pleasures must then be expressed in another way. I quote, the analyst must seek the physical basis and experience from which metaphorical speech springs. Since this achievement usually parallels the acquisition of language, Ella Sharp proposes that words become substitutes for bodily substances, originating either in onomatopoeia, that is affective links based on imitation of sounds, or ideational links, what she calls roots, organized, crystallized sounds that emerge to cover all the essential names needed for expressing relationships between persons, the individual and the environment, self-preservation, and procreative powers. In her account, expletives like damn or oh God can be a psychic equivalent to early bodily discharge. And if control is first learned through prohibition and punishment, words may become part of a similar need to control aggression and restrict not only bodily discharge, but the flow of words themselves. In a continuingly silent treatment, this may be one possible factor in which both actual bodily reactions and their eroticized or aggressive links with words are implicated. A range of communicative forms that become gradually established through the setting of each analysis. And for me, they do so actively, even when, and perhaps especially when, it's the idea of the analyst's receptivity, of the analyst being there, and what we understand by that, that becomes the focus. The extent to which the forms that every analytic couple develop between them become capable of change through the ongoing work of the transference countertransference dynamic is now not only thought of as related to the patient's psychopathology, but to the quality of the analytic relationship and to the possibility of a continuing flexibility, which can't be taken for granted, in either member of the analytic couple in encountering the other in the temporality of each session. The American analyst Fred Bush, writing in 1978, argues for the importance of the development of speech in the process of separation and individuation in children, and he uses this in his discussion of a silent adult patient, or adolescent patient, a young woman of 19, the elder child by 18 months of two girls, whose childhood was full of loneliness and obsessions, one of which was that her mother would die in a car accident. There were always long silences, and the patient herself associated talking with growing up, something she felt she had been made to do too soon. She associated this, when she did talk to Fred Bush, to not being understood by him. She would describe herself as too young to talk, and she wanted her analyst to understand her without a need for her to say or do anything. If she grew up, she thought, he would expect her to be different, and she associated this with being thrown out. Bush characterized his patients' silences as of two kinds, one of pleasure and tranquility, and one of tension and anguish, where the patient was clearly struggling. He noted that generally through speech, a child moves towards increasing autonomy and proposes, Fred Bush proposes, that in that earlier babbling stage, the baby relies on the mother for empathic satisfaction of need. The verbal productions don't necessarily have a communicative function. But when the child develops to what he calls passive language and directioned pointing, the child no longer relies solely on the mother. These stages depend on what he calls the establishment of internal representations, a recognition of a developmental process linked to environmental provision. In addition to these theoretical links offered by Ella Sharp and Fred Bush, I became interested in how the analyst, in this case me, can remain open and alive to a silent patient over an extended period. And other historic papers were of assistance here because there is quite a rich literature, really, in the analytic community about the silent patient. For instance, in Masood Khan's reconstruction of an early deprivation and the resultant antisocial tendency he discerned in a boy of 18, he distinguishes between muteness and silence, where muteness has a destructive, aggressive, belligerent tone to it, whereas silence is a more benign or neutral state. In general, Khan did not feel that this patient was in conflict with him. Rather, it was more like a state in which two people who could be alive and responsive to each other had become frozen and petrified by each other. I think many analytic silences may oscillate between these two modes. And as analysts, we have to be attentive to these affective shifts for how they alert us to the transference situation and the potential meanings of the silence. As Michael Parsons has discussed, the analytic setting exists not only externally, but it constitutes an area of the analyst's mind where reality is defined by unconscious symbolic meaning. And the Roman analyst, now dead, Carla de Toffoli, provides a very clear example of this in an article where she described her growing awareness of breathing and of birth throughout 9 months of silence in her treatment of a young student who came 4 times a week and slept. In that time, De Toffoli distinguished 12 types of breathing. She found variations in rhythm, in tempo, intensity in his respiratory activity. She lived with him, as she put it, through groaning, wheezing, exclamations, and she found herself imagining obstacles to oxygenation, stoppages in the blood flow, crushings of the umbilical cord, until, she said, they came to the tranquil flow of air from one to the other. And she saw, I quote, the texture of the self emerge contextually from the relationship and from the body. His bodily presence and my mind prefigured themselves and modeled themselves in turn. One day, her patient looked around and stroked the wall near the couch. He had woken up and emerged from inside her. Nina Coulthard's quite, at the time, notorious paper called Slouching Towards Bethlehem, Thinking the Unthinkable in Psychoanalysis, was first given at a conference called Beyond Words. The title, Slouching Towards Bethlehem, draws on Yeats's poem, The Second Coming. Coulthard, in this paper, tells us about losing her temper and screaming at her patient after months of hostile silence. She comments, a paper for a symposium whose overall title was Beyond Words, appropriately had to be generated in that very area, namely where blankness seemed to be. Coulthard thinks that any silence lasting 40 minutes or more begins to have its own interest. I think we might be interested before 40 minutes myself, but that was her position. And she says that profound silence itself, as well as what it conceals, can be, as in Yeats's poem, a rough beast which is slouching along in the depths of a communicative, articulate patient whose time may need to come around and be endured first in the analysis. Her patient, a captain of industry in his mid-50s, had never talked deeply to anyone about himself. So the first couple of years of his analysis were full of interchange and improvement. But Coulthard felt something else was gathering because he had initially come to her with his center not holding, a reference to the Yeats book, and with things falling apart. And she felt the initial improvement had not touched this core, had not really gone anywhere near it. Then her captain of industry ground to a halt and fell violently silent. He always came to all his sessions, but over months of silence, he became a different person. She describes how one day she became incredibly furious and she bawled him out, shouting that she wasn't going to stand for it a moment longer. This changed the analysis, and over the subsequent period, they came to see how much, to his, the patient's own surprise and horror, he had needed to live out and have experienced and endured by another person without retaliation his primary hatred of a genuinely powerful mother. In describing the setting as the first non-verbal communication, a sign that the analyst is taking up a certain attitude above all that of listening, Harold Stewart identifies silence as one of the most powerful conveyors of affects. But the clinical exchange is especially delicate when the silence of the patient becomes a notably significant factor in the analyst's knowing and not knowing, and in turn, the impact of the analyst's not knowing will gain importance for both analyst and analysand. When the patient is silent for extended periods, that silence organizes the analyst's responses, including the analyst's silence. Above all, it organizes our willingness to be used by our patients. So with Winnicott and Stewart, we see the patient's silence as both an achievement and a complex of communication. What does the clinician have to facilitate in herself to make it possible for those patients whose silence is what they want to communicate to feel accepted? And how do we respect this in our own response, even when it doesn't seem to bring the patient any closer to being able to give voice to their feelings of confusion, terror, anxiety, destructiveness, anger, love, hate, need, or dependence, or even necessarily to recognize any specific affect as the primary one they are feeling and unable to articulate. Now, all of this, deriving from Harold Stewart, set me thinking about receptivity and containers, and of holding and containing, those words that are always around these days in discussions of Bion and Winnicott. What is the level and kind of activity demanded of the analyst in this respect in an ongoingly silent session? Now, holding and containment offer rather different forms of receptivity on the part of the clinician, but both holding and containing involve an active encounter in the sustaining of any analytic relationship. While the word hold, the notion of holding, centrally includes also the idea of containment, the reverse, albeit less strongly, is also true. Additionally, the idea of contain has a meaning of keeping or retaining in a certain state, which is a much stronger connotation of restraint, of restriction, of confinement, of keeping under control or subjection. All meanings from the Oxford English Dictionary. So the extended range of meanings of hold also includes to have or keep in mind, or to hold in esteem. Now, all of these variations help us to identify the differentiation in choices about the work of the consulting room, that derive from the assumptions about what it means to be human and how we understand human nature, held respectively by Donald Winnicott and Wilfred Bion. Moreover, our theoretical assumptions about what we are or may be receiving from the patient will be central to what we do with what we receive and how we receive it, even when we don't necessarily know what it is. I have deliberately used the word hold in what I have been saying, says Claire Britton, the second wife of Winnicott, because while it obviously includes acceptance of the client and what the client gives us, it also includes what we do with what we accept. I think Monica's going to come in now, is that right?
Sí. Muchas gracias Leslie. Le vamos a dar ahora la palabra al doctor.
Thank you, Lesley. We'll give the word now to Dr. Panseira. Dr. Panseira is a psychoanalyst, is a physician, full member of the International Psychoanalytic Association, whole member of the Psychoanalytic Association of Buenos Aires. He was the chairperson of that association and also coordinator and founder of the Winnicott area. He is the former president of the University Institute of Adiba, Mental Health, author of Psychoanalytic Clinic based on Winnicott's Rethinking Psychoanalysis from the Person and Reflections on the Psychoanalytic Activity. Alfredo. Well, in the first place, I would like to thank Lesley because this paper has some virtue that not all papers have. This makes us think. And as Heidegger said, in what thinking means, the most important gift that we may have, the gift is the gift of what is not said, what's going to be said, and what makes us think. Winnicott defined psychoanalysis as a long, very long reception of a history. But this story, this history, alternates words and silences, during which the atmosphere and the capacity for identification by the analyst, empathy, intuition, do the rest within a reliable framework that makes it possible. We receive a story and a prehistory or a pre-story. Without words in general, through the atmosphere that's generated during the sessions and in a large way, through the silences, significant silence. In Winnicott, well, this question of silence has a story because it starts with the original contribution in what he calls the silent communication, typical of the subject-object relationship, during which there is silent communication in an identity bond, what we call primary, where the mother and the baby are experimentally a unit, and where both understand the mental contents of the other directly. The needs of the baby, the states of mind of the mother, they flow between the two of them. And this is what will happen again in the most extreme moments of regression to dependence when it's successful, generating in the analyst different experiences. But this will put to the test. In the paper Lesley mentioned about communicating and not communicating, he remarks emphatically the right to not communicate based on a personal experience, because he would not put up with the idea of feeling all the time exploited, let's say, used in this kind of permanent communication. And he remarks the right to actually retreat so as not to have to communicate all the time. There, he makes a difference between the simple non-communicating. A patient has to retreat placidly inside of himself if there's a place for him to rest. As the patient, when I asked her about her silence, she said, after a minute, I'm feeling myself of myself, something like that. An active or reactive non-communication, when the patient does so as a defense mechanism, safely away from any intrusion, or preserving a secret in other situations, in the case of patients with neurosis mainly. This opens the possibility to approach the topic of silence and silent patients, even though today we add communication that usually appears in silence and through silence, because some silences imply a deep existential communication, as when we stay closer to somebody and we share his pain, for example, through times of grief and mourning, or when we accompany a dying person. I have lived through these experiences through my years of analysis. In these particular cases, words are not necessary, and sharing feelings, using empathy, our identification capacity, trained identification capacity, is crucial. Masood Khan pointed out a different type of silences with patients, schizoid patients. So he says we can only share their silence, their discouragement, no words, simply waiting. The case Lesley mentioned shows us these two different types of silence for a differential diagnosis. The first one, silent communication, it's a moment of extreme vulnerability. Words break the bond. Communication is immediate. So there is no mental representation, and it always borders the ominous threat of the occurrence of unimaginable anguish. I don't think this is the case of Lesley's patient, who decides not to open up and then moves between silence and between the continuity of analysis or interruption for 1 year. Here, I believe that we are facing obstinate silence as an extreme defense in a hostile environment, in the case of an intrusive mother imposing her own guidelines and threatened some sort of rape of the being. I don't think that RTN is enough to include these type of cases with certain peculiarities, calling for even a different types of theoretical scaffolding that in this case is not present in Winnicott's paper to approach these patients. He starts by saying that words are one of the communicative tools in analysis, but not the only one. So we approach this question of communicative silences, just to say so, to put it some way, in one session. For example, if we record a session, we will find surprises. Oftentimes, most of the session is in silence, if not in the case of hypomaniac and talkative patients, because silence, after all, to paraphrase, for example, musicians, it actually rephrases the story, the narration. It generates expectations, the hidden sense of its and the setting, the atmosphere, the experiences of the analyst during the session itself. We have all been through that kind of setting with anguish and fear without even proposing this self. A phobic patient, these patients have some silent moments, or maybe the seduction of hysterical patients, or the careful and stormy speech of obsessive patients. So this is bordering terror, or for example, the analysis of psychotic patients, which could also imply a threat to our life or integrity. I remember a patient, for example, who came to the sessions and said, and he told me that he had decided to kill me. Of course, it was not successful. I would even say that this is the magma of analysis. It guides our task, and we sometimes don't mention that. When we analyze severe patients, silent patients who go through regression to dependence, maybe that's the essential part of the process. It goes through that silent communication and the atmosphere generated during the session and the perfect empathic connection with the analyst. I had a mental connection, absolute mental connection. When I was tired, the patient talked. That communication was, the direct communication was interrupted. And he said, I feel that my head and arms are talking. So his body image was fragmented. And this is what Winnicott said at the beginning. This integrates the self-representation of the body. He lived that again during the session. This paper, which is brilliant, shows the deep impact that a silent patient who finally moved away, this impact on the analyst herself and the stimulus for her imagination to be able to understand as how much you can understand and what things happen between the two of them in that complex analysis. So then there's a variety of problems, and that is what psychoanalysis is all about. The silent patients, silence itself, different types of silence, the intense affective communication between the patient and the analyst, the use of the word as a means to communicate, mediated, which tries once again imperfectly to translate unspeakable experiences that each of them has into something understandable for the other. So there is always a residue of what has not been said, so that communication is always imperfect. Well, I think I was okay with the time. I always think about my mom. When she says 10 minutes, I try to be observant of those 10 minutes. Thank you very much, Alfredo. Let's give the floor to Monica. She's a psychoanalyst. She is a teacher at the Psychoanalytic Association of Buenos Aires, former scientific secretary of that association, co-chair for Latin America of the Psychoanalysis Committee for Children and Adolescents and the International Psychoanalytic Association, coordinator of the postgraduate course for the VIC method, Davistock method at the Italian Hospital in Buenos Aires, co-director together with Chairman Hania from Great Britain of the International. Monica. Thank you, Rita. Good morning. I would like to thank the Executive Board and the Scientific Director of Aldeva for this invitation. It gives me the opportunity once again, because we did so in London before, together with Christine Ancier also, to be able to think together and accompany and contribute with some ideas, this wonderful work by Lesley. I said it's beautiful because I think it has an important value for clinical development and debate. Of course, I hope this meeting is a break for all of us in so much pain and grief as we're going through today. So thank you all for being here. As analysts, we have always been interested to experiment what analytical communication is about and what is Lesley's proposal in her paper. So this leads us to think about our role in transference in complex situations, as those reported with silent patients, those who are in that state for a long time, situations that may end up in unexpected endings of the treatments. And who looks after these end, the analyst or the patient? I like this idea by Winnicott that the patient has the right of non-communication. I would even add the patient can communicate as he pleases or as he tries to in his childhood world. He has the right to not adjust to our expectations about how to communicate in each session. Children during analysis can spend a long time in silence. That's why children's analysts, I would speculate, we are very well trained in putting up with this type of silence. In this field of interest, analytical receptivity, the qualities and conditions are a question for research for the author, and I like it that way. How to stay alive facing a patient who is persistently silent. Is there any receptivity analytical capacity that tolerates that? The different situations, the evolution, that will be a key point in the framework of our activity. I would like to share with you that for me, the way to research psychoanalysis, both the mental state of the patient and the analyst and what's going on during the session is through transference. The transference is the key, is the core of our psychoanalytic task. Of course, this is a potential way to investigate psychoanalysis among many others. And Dr. Caldwell invites us all to do that in her paper. So what is our task about? I like this question she proposes, is how far can we go with our analytical method? Possibly, I would dare say or speculate that we can go as far as the patient wants us to and as far as our limits lets us do so. I think these questions will lead us to an impasse and how to think about it. Of course, further on in this meeting. Now, let's talk about analysis and children. I can understand some ways of early transference, which are very troublesome and then appear in our adult patients. Maybe in this perspective, I can accompany Lesley's ideas. I would like to include from now on some considerations about the quality of words based on the experience of psychoanalysis with children. Maria wrote, and a disciple of Messer talked about silence in her clinical work with small kids. Many of her contributions come also from the observation of babies. She underlines this dual quality of words as a symbol and as sensorial constructs, according to the teachings of Mesler. These two aspects of language coincide in poetic diction, where emotion and the body image cause a mental impact. On the other hand, Messer has described how music and dance can provide a foundation for semantics in speech. In children's fantasy, words can touch the other, can be used as a physical bond, contact bond with the other person. What was the use Lesley's patients from her childhood mind gave to her words and the words of the analyst? What did the patient talk about when she seemed to be communicated a sensorial world full of noises and smells in the toilet? Something about the beauty of speech and dance seemed to be absent in that communication style. There's no beautiful sounds in toilets. Of course, there can be erotizing sounds, which is different from beauty. In this way, The patient gives some clues about what internal spaces she is occupying and where she is trapped from her sensories. Jim Magania talked a very interesting book about silent children based on his experience for many long years at the Longman Street Hospital in a hospital in London. And she describes 5 mental states that can account for silence based on her clinical experience and observation of babies. Of course, if there's interest in this topic, I will go back to it. Maybe we can shift gears here and talk about psychoanalytic tasks. Judy Clover talks about the observation method by Esther Beek, saying, it is like going into a different level of understanding where we frequently, there's no communication, but it's always present. The baby in the child, in the adult, in the teenager, and a significant communication, feelings that are conveyed to the analyst without words. Some of this experience, I believe, clearly evidences Lesley, well, she talks about that when she mentions Dr. Toffoli. She talks about this awareness of breathing for 9 months of silence when treating a young student who went to sessions 4 times a week and slept. In that period of time, she was able to identify 12 breathing paces or rhythms. What happens with this primitive child world is present in the clinical world as present in Toffoli's work. And then these patients prefer to communicate in this way. They have a receptive mind of the analyst, and this is the recognition of this. He knows that the child's world is early managed in this way, that is body sensations. And self is supported there to even talk about a contingent objects. Ms. Beck explained this very well. And when this type of interjection fails and the subject, whether it's a child, a teenager, or an adult, is trapped in these senses, including words, outside the intimate relationships. Something like this seems to have happened with Lesley's patient. Thank you very much, Lesley, for talking about Dr. Toffoli. With her clinical approach, we confirm once again that we do not need to know everything that's happening between us and a patient during the session. Sometimes it's good enough to be close, to be attentive to the primitive processes the patient tells us about, to put up with the anxiety this may bring about, maybe a mental function that is key for the patient, the analyst, and that is patience. Well, so this inner child in Lesley's patient seemed not to want help. Maybe she had dreams, like in the case of Toffoli's patient, but she was rather provocative, I believe. I would prefer to talk about provocation now. Maybe we can discuss this in detail later on. I prefer to talk about provocation rather than sadism. For some time now, I have been considering that hostility many times refers to other issues. The patient is in an Oedipic world with a lot of childhood pain, and this makes our work possible. Even as in the case of the Coltat patient, when then he becomes very angry. Both the patient and the analyst become very angry, because then we can learn about the demons that we are facing. What are the phases of that demon? Then I would like to include my experience with a small patient, with a little patient. I believe that Lesley's patient uses silence and her fantasies and intransference much more difficult to understand for any analyst. To conclude, I think I'm running out of my time. I would like to mention Manikar. Manikar helps us understand attempts of the patient to try and understand, to try and makes us understand how uncomfortable he was. The analyst should feel that. In my opinion, this is an interesting idea: analytical receptivity, observation, and work on the mechanisms that patient's projections are based, and the analyst approach. Of course, this idea was then analyzed further on. What happens? Well, this is a classical idea in terms of receptivity. Then we can include other ideas, including the geographical and perspective, to conclude the first part. What happens between the analyst and the patient during silence? What is the role of fantasies in the unconscious mind of the patient in living in the internal object to be permanently in silence? Which is the role of language in the children's world, internal landscapes to be discovered? I think this is our task. And when, for example, dealing with negative transfers, that no doubt will happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Monica. Now Lesley has the floor again for the second part of her presentation. Lesley, you have the floor. Quisiera decir que no sé si hay otras personas escuchando en inglés.
Now, a wide array of meanings and experiences are necessarily gathered in to such analytic experiences, and my own hesitation in summarizing them as representing predominantly any one affect or one diagnosis relates to the to and fro of the transference throughout the 8 years I saw her. But if I had to prioritize one affect as gaining more and more importance, I would probably characterize it as fear. To say that this is to open up further the issue of fear. Of what? Of who? When? Why? What of an internal world in which a lifetime of encounters with inner objects could perhaps be characterized around powerful superego functions or insistent persecutory anxiety? She is a patient, or was a patient, for whom Winnicott's description of those who fear breakdown might be appropriate. I quote, "There are, very roughly speaking, two kinds of human beings. Those who do not carry around with them a significant experience of breakdown in earliest infancy, and those who do carry around with them such an experience, and who must therefore flee from it, flirt with it, fear it, and to some extent always be preoccupied with the threat of it." In all the Winnicott papers I have mentioned, he is raising the question of disturbance in very early encounters of infant and environment, and how and what those encounters produced in and for the infant. In another account, he proposes another idea, the idea of withdrawal. He says, by withdrawal, I mean momentary detachment from a waking relationship with external reality. This detachment being sometimes in the nature of a brief sleep. This is in his discussion of the interesting case history holding an interpretation that he did from about 1953 to 1955, where he regards withdrawal as not enabling the kind of productive contact of what he calls a regression to dependence, and what a regression to dependence could potentially do. Now, silence may constitute a kind of withdrawal, and on occasion, it did seem to be one dimension of some of my patients' many silences. But continuing silence is not a momentary phenomenon, and persistent continuing silence, whether we characterize it as withdrawal or not, can elicit a range of very confusing emotions in both analytic partners, which may culminate in a wish or demand from one or the other to halt the therapeutic process, which I think is effectively what happened with my patient. Now, I approach, as we all do these days, the whole field in the light of the advances in our understanding of the analytic relationship itself, especially through the increased attention to the role of the analyst. The Roman neuropsychiatrist and psychoanalyst Giovanna Goretti Ragazzoni proposes that increased attention to the environment has had repercussions for our analytic technique, the most important of which is an increased attention to what the analyst says and does, and I quote, the accurate exploration of the effects she produces through the analysis of the patient's reactions to her interpretation. She sees this shift in our concerns as accounting for a reduced resort to projection as explanation, because, I quote, the analyst is more ready to become responsible for the ways in which she is perceived by the patient. As a consequence, in every situation of impasse, of negative therapeutic reaction, of interminable analysis, the analyst places herself on a level of joint responsibility, ready to identify what she did, what she didn't do, what she did in an inadequate way. I did wonder if the notion of the negative therapeutic reaction as an extreme form of negative transference could provide a useful way of approaching those patients who had provided a clinical impetus for my interest in silence. Most extensively discussed in The Ego and the Id, Freud distinguishes the negative therapeutic reaction from other forms of resistance, in that the patient apparently prefers to go on suffering. And in a footnote, he comments, analysis does not set out to make pathological reactions impossible, but to give the patient's ego the freedom to decide one way or other. Later, in Analysis Terminable and Interminable, he attributes it more conclusively to the death drive and an unconscious sense of guilt, while recognizing that such a conclusion provides no real answer to the clinical problems we face. Freud's final account underlines the limits of psychotherapeutic possibility, a perspective that I think we have become increasingly willing to consider as we have come to realize the complexity of what it is that we do. What is the clinician's task when the patient seems unable or unwilling to make use of the freedom that Freud writes of, or displays a refusal or an inability to recognize it? He, Freud, describes the negative therapeutic reaction as a clinical phenomenon organized around an internal response to analysis on the part of the patient. But Nino Ferro emphasizes that phenomena of that kind are often caused by the analysis of content rather than process, in conjunction with what Ferro calls the dysfunction of the receiver. That is, they are an effect of the treatment and of the analytic relationship. Now, the demands required with these sorts of patients require us to make decisions about how we continue to work, and that will depend on how we understand or fail to understand the origins of the patient's difficulties and what we see those origins as calling for from us in our analytic work with them. When the patient is silent for extended periods, that silence, as I said, organizes our responses, including our silence. As Howard Levine said in a recent presentation on Winnicott's fear of breakdown paper, we are only now beginning to appreciate the extent to which Bion's theory implies that there is often, perhaps always, a covert appeal for regulatory help in even the most resistant, avoidant, attacking, or destructive actions that are driven by the fear of breakdown and other examples of the compulsion to repeat. Now, I have associated this position that Howard thought about in relation to Bion with Winnicott, but I think it is another example of the way Winnicott and Bion's thinking was converging in the 1960s. For both of them, it is an emphasis on the importance of the part of the analyst. Is it now Monica and Alfredo, Rita?
Muchas gracias, Lesley. Ahora le voy a dar la palabra a Rosy. Ella va a
To
Rosie will
Rosa,
continue with
and
the
she will
coordination.
continue. Now, let's listen to Licenciada Mónica Cardenal, the comment to this interesting material Lesley has just presented. Thank you, Rosie, once again. Thank you, Lesley. I would like to go back to, in this second part of the discussion, now that we have more material about this question of transference and countertransference, with a question about treatment. The fear to closeness to the analyst, could that be something the patient thought about? What's the relationship between the possibility of understanding and the actually happening of this impasse? Or something like this was pending in the analysis, as far as the infantile aspects are in internal spaces of the analyst's mind. According to my first ideas, it's very hard from there to measure distance and closeness. The analyst says that she was able to detect certain rhythm in the happening of sessions throughout the treatment, more words at the beginning, silence at the end. This rhythm, this pace somewhat shows the closeness or the distance between the analyst and the patient. Now, in case of silence, the analyst says that the interest, the patient's interest, curiosity seemed not to decrease, and it alternated with extreme irritability. She also says how relieved she was when the patient finally gave up treatment. Maybe her patient wanted to relieve her, in fact, because of this terrible burden that she herself from her infantile unconscious mind was provoking to the analyst. Because for the infantile logic, this is a kind of way out. Maybe it's the only possibility to go out. It's interesting to see how the analyst uses, how the patient used words. In the first year of treatment, they seem to be more passionate, defensive. Of course, this clearly defines a very clear use of the words in analysis. Words more clearly for the mind in the infantile fantasy may represent an equation and maniac defense, but just a way to touch the analyst, to actually involve the analyst, a very real way to be in contact. The use of language at the same time includes the object in a real fashion. As Lesley reports, something different, something more sincere started to happen when the patient actually became silent. At this point, and then to accompany Lesley's ideas about silence in our patients and receptivity, analytic receptivity, I would like to reconsider the introspective processes. These are an interest point for me now in my work with patients, and I think the effects in the clinical practice has not been well studied. Maybe we talk more about projects. I like this idea by Martha Harris in 1978, when she says, introjection is still a mysterious process. How to get involved and depending on objects in the external world that are captured by the senses, described in the language that has evolved to actually manage the external reality, how they can become assimilated and they are transforming the mind in what we call the psychoanalytic object. They may contribute to the personality growth. How does this happen? How does this mysterious process take place? A mother with the capacity to be close to her baby can understand the fears and provide relief. The baby then experiences and feels that he has a place in her mind and body. It's the idea of the feeling of being understood and even relieved, physically speaking. The concept here is related to this experience. If the baby then is able to introject this receptive continent, then he develops inside himself an internal object, an inner object that helps him tolerate all the feelings, as Lesley well described, love, the fears, love, and even hatred. As Meisler said, this is possible. Once this is possible, the thinking and then language and the mind is conceived as a tool able to transform the elements of dreams into language. As Meisler says, this gives place to identification with speaking objects, identification with objects that are inspiring for talking, for learning and for talking, and then come into a relationship with others. What has happened with this in patients, in Lesley's patients? Maybe she felt received or housed in this loving object. But what I'm interested in here is, maybe it's a point for discussion later on, is this question of this continent function implies that the baby, the child, is housed somehow inside the mind. The state the baby can have to know that he is inside somebody, not intrusively, but is actually dwelling there lovingly. Did this patient ever feel like that as she was dwelling inside? How can we explain that? Of course, giving accommodation, let's say, well, maybe we will talk about holding and containment. The possibility that this baby can feel that he is held inside his mother is necessary for him to develop the symbolic relationship, and then language occurs. I'm saying this, that its inner experience is key for words to circulate between self and the object. I understand. And according to Martha Harris, containing, so holding, means that the baby has an experience about himself and the world around him inside a modulating from the most primitive and fearing feelings. So this leads, which leads to negative feelings, even hate. So then he may have access about himself and the world through the emotional experience since childhood, since a very early age. A very different situation from being trapped inside this object, desperate to have a place inside that, and of course, unable to go out. The Lesley's patient, was she able to be like actually housed inside this wonderful containment or container? Or maybe she wants to make it something more personal, more similar to herself, intrusively from inside. She's getting hold of all the words of the analyst. I'm convinced that this patient had in mind all of Lesley's words and knowledge. That's why she's so critical. Maybe there's no need to talk because the infantile aspects of the patients, well, it's a fantasy. She knows about the words Lesley is going to use or Lesley used. Of course, there's nothing more to listen to in her analysis. This inner child from her omniscience, as Lesley said, all knows. And of course, she's very defiant. What else is she supposed to say? So she slams the door and walks away. So her infantile aspects, well, that's what she feels. She would never be able to put up with. She goes a step ahead. She will be the last one to slam the door. This type of fantasy is different from being excluded from the mother and father couple. She is dominating all the words, and maybe that's the only way to exist and be inside this object. Can she get out of there alone? Well, she can do that by acting, just leaving her analysis. The end of analysis, as far as I understand, was because of her despair and not because of destruction. I also like when Lesley wonders, she wonders about hatred. Well, I interpreted that many times. I don't think this is the point, and I agree. Another interesting point about the technique, something Lesley also discusses. What type of emotional development or what type of mental status of the mind? What is the level Lesley was directing her actions? If the interpretation is directed to internal aspects the analyst considers more mature than they really are, this could be provocative for the unconscious childhood world, not just because the analyst is not understanding, but it can also be thought of as a mocking or by these childhood aspects. I would like to go back to this point. Some considerations to conclude. I would like to think about countertransference and analytical impacts. About analytical impacts, well, I have mentioned some ideas. Well, thanks to everything Lesley has said, what happens when treatment ends suddenly? Well, it's painful for any analyst, of course, because I agree with Lesley. Part of our task, our activity in this clinical journey, let's say, actually failed. I agree with Meisler that it usually happens. The Meisler is at the threshold of depression. When the patient feels that he is controlling her pain and her wickedness, her moral pain, let's say, when this is at stake, the therapeutic negative, the therapeutical reaction can lead to impasse because of the use of extreme mechanisms of defense with a lot of paranoid anxiety. We may also think about two reasons following my ideas and Leslie's. One of them is related to the exercise of an analytic task. There can be some disadjustments in the framework, and another cause could be traumatic factors in the history of the development of our patients. I believe that Lesley considers both options. I would like to mention here Horacio Echegoshin, who, well, in his excellent management of impasse, that the technique is included here. Of course, there's a lot for discussion, a lot of food for thought here. Something about countertransference and transference. Once again, I will make some reference to Maneker. Maneker said, I will try and formulate what I believe happens when analysis is okay. I believe there's quite oscillation between projection and introjection. When the patient is talking, the analyst it gets involved, and after understanding, he reprojects and interprets. Some patients are hard to treat for any analyst. Suspensions, discontinuation in treatment, well, we feel that when darkness is in the interpretation of our understanding, we have lost the thread. We have lost the thread of what's happening. Interesting here, Maneker says that this is a possibility for a new situation that's tension for both patient and analyst. It's different to the tension existing in our task. So there could be repair feelings to mitigate this impulse. The anxiety levels can also increase in us, analysts, which leads to a really disturbing cycle. Well, I think this is all. So very briefly, thank you, Lesley Caldwell, for this opportunity to share your paper, your beautiful paper. Apart from dealing with demons, our patients' demons and our demons, psychoanalysis is one of the mostly fully humane activities. Now, in a very low voice, this is what a child said after the session. and he came back after 2 days. He said in a low voice, "Be a good boy and wait in silence." Thank you. Thank you, Monica. Now we'll listen to Dr. Alfredo Paniciari's comments. Alfredo, please. Well, typically, we consider silence as something that implies distance and word as something implying closeness. I think Lesley makes us think that oftentimes it's exactly the other way around. Possibly, communication is more intense between two human beings. And well, these communications usually happen in silence. It's a moment, Winnicott says, crossed identification. Others call it empathy. Others, we have examples of that. And sometimes some silences imply a very long distance, well, like the final silence in Leslie's patient. So I believe that we are trying to think about significance and meaning here of the word silence. I have often worked with many silent patients. I had many psychotic patients. Psychotic patients, well, they establish deep communication in silence. It's not distance what they do. In the most moments of proximity, there's silence. And when there's more distance, and in schizophrenia, they are absolutely silent moments. So I believe that we are more and more aware that we are using our intuition, our capacity of identification, our sensitivity. Because Winnicott says that countertransference implies answers related to conflicts that are unconscious and absolutely impossible to reach a person's conscience. Shows what this has to do with our capacity. This is different from countertransference that Freud calls reciprocal countertransference. That's a material that we cannot access to except for analysis. Now, this question of silence in this paper with a silent patient who remained silent for a long time until she finally discontinued treatment in silence as well. I imagine maybe she was. So again, Winnicott says that the patient is protecting himself with silence many times, dramatically from some sort of rape of the id. And he says that it's even worse that being raped or eaten by cannibals. And he masterly talks about the interplay of the patient who does not want to be discovered or who at the same time wants to be discovered. I always remember the example of a schizophrenic patient who was hospitalized. She had been hospitalized for the last 15 years. She was absolutely in silence, trying to contact the world as little as possible. She was in bed. She was with her body bent. And so that had caused hypertrophy of the neck muscles. She had one hand closed tightly, so her nails had actually gone into her flesh. I came close to the bed and I tried to separate one of her fingers. Then the patient uttered the only words I heard from her. She said, "No, you are taking life away from me." That was the last resort to being close to life. That was the only thing that made her feel alive. That was in her fist. The analyst of 40 says about the detection of two types of breathing and imagines during these long hours in silence that the patient was repeating the process, the pregnancy and delivery processes when she was not doing anything in silence, complete silence, while trying to find a plausible sense based on the alterations of her breathing rate. Winnicott says about communication with a patient encompassing the breathing rate with this patient, just confirming his identification. And I remember a patient who had a sort of conscious blackout and then started breathing more and more with more and more agitation. He became cyanotic and then had a seizure. And with that patient, hypothetically, we were able to reconstruct the original scenes, early scenes, that he then checked. He had gone through with a grandmother he hadn't seen in years. In this non-communication, still we would have to include the simple non-inclusion of the other, as Mazzucani says, like relationships of unpersonal objects, uninterchangeable objects related to a false existence when objects do not hold the catexis or significance. This will lead to impersonal communication. So we are not excluded actively, but we are not included rather. And communication, the most important communication Winnicott refers to as communication in terms of identification and cross-identification and encounter and Asperger's as existential communication. Existence, for example, is based on this relationship. It can include long periods of shared silence. Lesley's patients, in the case of Lesley's patients, I believe that there was some sort of interchange, intellectual interchange. And so we face the early use of dissociated minds as the foundation of this false adaptative self. The analyst tolerates this type of interchange. When the patient offers some material, which she then tries to find and explain, and so that then this is buried and access to itself is inaccessible. So analysis is an intellectual interplay, reporting maybe the existence of the use, defensive use of the intellectual mind and the demands for perfection that she herself uses for herself and for the analyst. I believe that from the very beginning, this was occurring when she chose the analyst. Also, because of the undoubtedly prestige of this analyst, she chooses somebody that she believes she will be able to have intellectual interchange, almost like from colleague to colleague. And then she uses the analyst as an intelligent speaker. Maybe the material, her own material, is between the analyst and herself to talk both of them about this material. She decides what's important for communication and what is not important to communicate. So that's why she says she has nothing to say. She filters the topic to be discussed, and then she looks for, well, using her intellectual mind, she tries to find logical explanations preventing this material to go to other depths. Maybe disappointed by the analytical attitude of the analyst, she loses interest. The analyst does not give her certainties, and we must remember that in this regressive patient, when we talk about fears or anguish, we're not talking about anxiety or castration, but we're talking about an unimaginable anguish. We're talking about fear to break down. Maybe after the third year, the patient was able to reach to even get involved in analysis and the free association. In this particular case, when she discarded the intellectual aspects, that would have been more, these occurrences maybe face her with the risk of accepting these ununderstandable aspects and this vacuum on which she had built this false adaptative self, which had helped her live so far. Lesley, I understand that the change was going to happen because of the receptive silence and shared silence, and not because of the interchange of knowledge. When she faces this vacuum, she believes the analyst will show her her failures. The patient has two severe accidents, although she was fit. Maybe it was a warning about the risk of the necessary destructuring. In this regression to dependence, this showed her final withdrawal, or maybe she wanted to give a last option to the analyst. Well, this is Alfredo's comment. Thank you, Rita. Now, Lesley, we will continue with the third part of your presentation.
Can I first, before I go to the third part, how very interested I am in the comments of Alfredo and Monica, and I hope we have an opportunity to come back to them in the general discussion. Okay, so Monica has mentioned money curl, and I am going to go on to do the same. In his paper on countertransference from 1960, Winnicott maintains that what comes between the patient and the analyst is the analyst's professional attitude, his technique, what he does with his mind. I think this may have stood me in good stead in holding me in the aftermath of many sessions, but it did not lead me to my finding a way of enabling this patient to speak of an internal situation that, as I think Alfredo has said, was probably always beyond words, was unthinkable. In Nina Coulthard's phrase, the beast slouching towards Bethlehem to be born was not delivered. It is for the analyst. In approaching the problems this patient presented, I turned both to Winnicott on countertransference and his earlier work on hate in the countertransference and what he calls the truly objective countertransference, or if this is difficult, the analyst's love and hate in reaction to the actual personality and behavior of the patient based on objective observation. In such cases, Winnicott suggests, both partners in the analytic relationship are drawn into feelings and situations above all demanded by the patient. For Winnicott, in this sort of analytic work, which theoretically he links with early emotional states, there is no failure except environmental failure. That is, the analyst is always dealing with her own failures, which strangely enough, I quote, tend to take on the pattern with each patient of the environmental failure of that patient. In other words, says Winnicott, when we fail with our patients, we can look into our own unconscious countertransference or our own inhibitions or compulsions. We can be as self-critical as we like. But with the patient, we must be able to see the failure as something that the patient has enabled us to do in a particular way so as to bring the original environmental failure into the present moment. Winnicott's paper, 1960, and his approach formed part of a wider discussion about countertransference in the 1950s. And his paper led me to the most thoughtful and important account I read, that of Roger Moneycurl, already quoted by Monica. Moneycurl's paper, Normal Countertransference and Some of Its Deviations, proposes that the analyst's understanding fails, quote, when the patient corresponds too closely with some aspect of himself, which he has not yet learnt to understand, and that if the analyst is disturbed, it is likely that the patient has contributed to it and is, in turn, disturbed by it. In identifying the analyst's emotional disturbance, the patient's part in bringing it about, and finally the effect of both on the patient, Moneycurl suggests that the analyst may end up being more likely to respond to his patient's mood precisely because he has lost his empathy with it, with the consequence that the patient picks up the analyst's negativity, a negativity that may be linked, quote, to a temporary failure or a permanent failure to understand the patient, so that the patient becomes a persecution to the analyst because he is felt to be incurable. We analysts then, he says, are faced with a particular triple task. We have to become aware of the defensive mechanism in ourselves. We have to become aware of our patient's part in bringing it about. And lastly, we have to remain aware of the effect on the patient of the patient's effect on us. Both Winnicott and Moneycurl suggest that the dynamics of the analytic session can be managed by the analyst closely interrogating her own responses and displaying a willingness and a flexibility in terms of her own technique. Certainly, it is only through the possibility of such openness that they hold out the possibility of change for the patient. But the maintenance of our professional attitude and our own survival is the necessary but not the sufficient condition for the patient's movement. Ralph Greenson suggested that the negative therapeutic reaction in his experience is invariably an example of insufficient analysis of transference hate. But acknowledging this raises both the possible origins of that hate, why it makes an appearance when it does, and how the analyst finds the resources to respond to it. In general, I am completely skeptical of whether the consistent analysis of a patient's hatred, and certainly my interpretation of this patient's hatred, would have shifted the dynamic between us rather than further entrenching it. I did on occasion, incredibly rarely, interpret it, but it made little difference. And I think I probably did it somewhat desperately for myself, rather than holding on to any conviction that it was in the right thing to do for the patient. Andre Green notes that our responses, the analytic community's responses to the negative therapeutic reaction, tend to take the form either of saying how the patient is impossible to analyze, or how the analyst feels herself to have failed completely. He says, here we are looking at two sides of the same coin. By considering our own part in the analytic stuckness, our joint responsibility for the situation, we may be able to break through to a different capacity in the patient. But it is also essential to keep in mind Freud's suggestion that there may be something, for whatever reason, in the patient that makes the issue of progress unacceptable and untenable. We also know that the analyst's own willingness to approach the experience of hate and its deadening effect on the analytic couple doesn't guarantee the hate will be resolved. And here I would particularly like to add the observation made by Pontelise, which is quoted by Andre Green in his work on the negative therapy, on the negative. That is, Pontelise says, we must not confuse failure in psychoanalytic treatment with the negative therapeutic reaction. Rather, I think we should regard both silence and the negative transference in general, and its particularly entrenched versions in particular, as providing an opportunity, albeit a very demanding and uncomfortable opportunity, for learning and furthering our understanding of the enormous complexity of human beings and the need in our daily work with patients to come to terms with our own limits while still maintaining our belief in and commitment to the work of analysis is now increasingly regarded as an extremely complex exchange where outcomes are jointly dependent on patient psychopathology and the analytic relation in its conscious and unconscious dimensions. Nina Coulthard said, each hour is an act of faith in ourselves, in the process, and faith in the secret, unknown, unthinkable things in our patients, which in the space which is the analysis are slouching towards the time when their hour comes round at last. As I quoted above, the analyst is always dealing with her own failures, which strangely enough tend to take on the pattern with each patient of the environmental failure of that patient. I have been reading and teaching and in writing saying these sentences of Winnicott's for many years, but it is only the opportunity that your invitation provided to rethink this case and my own approach to it that led me to recognize the immediate relevance to this analysis of my own insistence on words when I thought I was not doing that at all. I just want to end by saying that this patient was presented to a workshop of Heidi Feinberg's on listening to listening in Madrid in 2018. And as Monica said, it was part of a panel at the IPA Congress in London in 2019 with Monica and with Christine Anzier from New York. I am very grateful to those colleagues in those other situations and to Monica and Alfredo today for their very useful comments on my work. Thank you all very much.
Muy bien. Bueno, les cuento que estamos demorados 20
tell you that we are 20 minutes behind according to our schedule. So the technical team says that we can go on a couple of minutes more. Anyway, please let's stick to time because there's, well, somebody may have another meeting and maybe has to leave the meeting before. So now, okay, we'll concentrate on a set of comments. I would like to listen to a very, very short interchange between Lesley, Monica, and Alfredo, and then we will talk, we will have some minutes for Q&A. As we don't think we will be able to read all the questions, we will send the panelists all the questions. And also This meeting will be on our YouTube channel in a couple of days. So you will have, without the clinical material, of course. So this will be available, the whole conference, without the clinical material, of course. So Lesley, is there anything else you would like to say about Alfredo? What Mónica said, right? Sí, bueno, hay muchas cosas para comentar, pero ahora están todas, bueno, he hablado tanto yo misma.
The only thing I would like to say is that Alfredo has introduced the question of the deeply psychotic patient and the place of silence and words in his practice with them. Monica has introduced the question of children and the importance of silence in relation to children. And I think both of these expansion of the area of my patient give us extra information and extra aspects that can broaden out the discussion. The other thing that I want to say is that Alfredo and his references are largely very similar to mine, whereas Monica's references to Meltzer and to Martha Harris are apparently very different. And yet what is so interesting for us now in 2021 is the potential overlap of what were and are thought of as very different oppositional ways of thinking. And yet we can see in the way that Monica, Alfredo and I have all introduced other theorists, the considerable overlap in our ways of approaching silent patients. So thank you.
Gracias, Lesley.
Alfredo, Mónica, any comments? Yes, I can start. I can make a comment, Alfredo. What is the idea? I can start? Mónica, please, because I don't think Alfredo is available right now. I'm sorry, I'm here, but okay, let Mónica speak. Okay. Okay, we're glad to see you back. So very briefly, it's interesting because I am talking with two Winnicott advocates, I would say, but I never felt far from your way of thinking, although I have some inner objects I talk with in my analytical function. I have other key opinion leaders in mind, but I never felt far from the material, and I was able to understand and also getting closer to Lesley in her difficult task with this particular patient. I simply, well, maybe we can pick up on that again later. I would like to speak about language and the question of omniscience, of this all knowledge. And this, of course, is a post-Kleinian idea, of course. For a small kid, when they start talking, well, this somehow or other means that they have all the knowledge and words their parents, his parents have. It's the fantasy. That's why when children develop well and the links are okay, there's so much interest and even passion. The child has a passion to learn and talk. And this is because they are dominating something about this omniscience idea of their parents and their language. Well, thinking about words flow among children. So that's my first comment. And sorry, based on what Lesley said, I would have very much liked to know how this child, my patient, as a child, started talking. And so what was the relationship in her family? And I would have liked to listen to the same question. I would have wondered myself exactly the same question, the same interest. A lot of coincidences, of course. Alfredo, we listen to you. Well, I couldn't hear the last part. I was trying to go back. Now I'm using my cell phone. I'm sorry I missed the last comments, Lesley. Well, this is a really very interesting paper, and this motivates us to think. I remember that, on the other hand, when you talked about omniscience, when Monica talked about that, I believe there's something that's true. We forget sometimes that words are always a manifestation, an incomplete manifestation of what we experience and live through. And we try to translate into words those experiences that are absolutely impossible sometimes to translate. In deep communications, well, Riverson used to say many years ago, it's one of the only philosophers who talked about Winnicott. They talked about when he stopped dreaming. And that was very important in his life because Berson's article was called Dreams and Creativity, two dimensions that actually are present in Winnicott's works. He said that we have to use a metaphor. I would say poetry. So metaphorical expressions relating to that, and that allowed us to recreate inside yourself what you want to convey. And I remember that when I was teaching dream interpretation a couple of years ago, many years ago, I said that it was important to distinguish and well, there was a dream that was impossible to access. A dream you remember, it's accessible only for the person remembering it because you remember the images, the sensations, etc. A narrated dream, well, the translation is the first traitor because the images have to be translated into words. A dream you listen to with all the setting and the atmosphere around it, involving, let's say, this narration, a dream represented where you mentally, when you say, what did this person dream of? And an interpreted dream, that is what I understand from your dream. So based on this complex, well, we have associations that allowed us to interpret dreams. Sometimes we think that we have access to the dream directly, and the dream by itself is inaccessible. What the patient is experiencing is inaccessible. Wanting to analyze only the language, what the patient is telling us is incomplete, because all the hidden senses that somehow or others will appear, well, all the emotions, what Winnicott called the affective reactions of the analyst, we can call it countertransference if you want, that put into a context what the patient is narrating, and also puts into context the silence and improve that communication. Lesley has mentioned this topic in depth. And well, this has to make us think. This is very thought-provoking, especially when psychoanalysis is conceived in different schools as the analysis of speech. We always talk in the first person, as Winnicott said. For us, it's very important to consider what the person is saying, what the person is living through, not so much the analysis of the speech itself. I believe that all that makes the difference between the intellectual exercise, purely speaking, of a text and what may help us establish a direct contact with the person we are analyzing. Thank you very much. Thank you, Lesley, and thank you all. I'm sorry about these communication problems, but they are not intrinsic to myself precisely. We have uncertainty all around us, and this is what's happening today. I simply repeat what my old friend, Luis Enrique Pewe, a Uruguayan psychoanalyst, said. He said, last time he came to Argentina, he said that he had only one certainty, that he was not going to die young. And this is the only certainty I myself have. And thank you very much. Thank you, Alfredo. Yes, we know there are difficulties, but we were able to read your paper. So interesting paper. So now we have two questions. We have a question here from Dr. Carlos Nemirovsky, the scientific secretary of our association, and another country from a training analyst from USAM, that is a university institute related to the psychoanalytic course, Licenciado Martin Fiori. So your questions, please. Okay, I start. Yes, Carlos, thank you. Pablo Aymar, a well-known sportsman, said that not the victories educated him. We still have a lot to learn from the cases we're not able to fix or solve as we would have liked to. Lesley herself wonders, open commas, what is the analyst's role for patients who want to communicate by being in silence for long periods of time and be accepted? To answer this question is to understand that the analyst's commitment, who in this case was alive and sensitive to her patient, was not the result of neutrality. We are not a white screen, and we know that our participation and commitment is as important as the patient's. Lesley also says in her report, giving the patient an answer was vital for the patient. I believe this has to do with the expectations of the analytical relationship, or that this analytical relationship, the patients actually, I wonder what was missing in this relationship. Does Lesley today think that if she had participated in a different way, things would have turned out differently? What is it that she was not able to offer her patient? She went into this prolonged silence, so as enactment also, and then she made a unilateral decision to quit treatment. So after so many years, Lesley, what do you think? What do you think triggered this action? Why did the patient decide to leave? I think Lesley has given us a couple of answers. I would like to know if you can expand a little bit on that.
Thank you, Carlos.
Gracias, Carlos.
Lesley, ¿quieres contestar ahora o escuchamos la otra pregunta, como prefieras?
I'd like to listen to another question.
Sure. Right.
Sí, segura.
Another question, Rosa?
Muy bien, entonces, Martín, si querés formular tu pregunta, por favor.
Martín, you can go ahead with your question. Good morning, and thank you for the invitation to ask a question here. Thank you, Lesley, for your paper, and especially for bringing here an interesting topic such as silence at a time when at a Zoom, another person had mute us, and we can be muted for a long time, actually, just listening to others. So I believe that this is a moment where noise and silence is a historical moment. Of course, silence and noise have a key importance. So the questions that cropped up have to do with intimacy. Really, today, our analytical work has to do with putting words and thoughts, but also we are in a time when we can offer an opportunity or a framework for an intimate encounter with another person. Maybe aggression may crop up. It must have been a very significant experience for your patient, Lesley, to actually get angry, to be silent, to say what she said, to tell you what she said after such a long time of these positive analytical encounters. Maybe the question is, intimacy is not also today a value we offer and that we include in our analytical work. My second question is on curiosity. You, I believe, you were very curious about why this patient was silent. And also I was wondering whether this patient who was silent for such a long time with this RTN or NTR, sorry. Okay, what was going on? If things had changed or were different? That's my question. Thank you. Lesley? Gracias, Martín.
Rosa, do you want me to respond to these now?
Sí, por favor. Después vamos a...
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I think there is one of the things that we analysts seem and have seemed so interested in is language, words, and in the last 20 or 30 years, almost an obsession with the idea of thinking. And I think that the things that Alfredo has mentioned, the questions that people have raised, and my own experience, I, a person devoted to words, as I imagine most analysts are. The verbal register, the possibility of communication in words, etc., has been so important. And at the same time, the longer I practiced as an analyst, the more I became aware of what Alfredo was drawing attention to, the inadequacy of words to be able to convey to someone else our internal affects and experiences. So I think the issue of words becomes more and more, for me, more and more central about both how much I enjoy them and how inadequate they are to the work they have to do, the work of communication between human beings in general, and the work of communication between human beings in the consulting room. So I think that's one big thing. And perhaps the things that the questions have related to about intimacy, curiosity, actual emotions, the question of silence and noise, and the parallels or potential parallels with where we all currently are. Alfredo's difficulty in his connection, my difficulty in hearing the connection at first, the situation we find ourselves in where we want to communicate and share with each other is so hampered by things not in our control. And perhaps that is one other way of thinking about the different ways in which the question of the centrality of psychoanalysis in our lives is being presented to us now in the very different conditions of the pandemic. There's the question of noise that Martin raised, I think. And one of the issues might be when this patient was busy offering me rational explanations for everything in the world and in my life and hers, was that a form of communication, as Alfredo suggested, or was it noise to not communicate? These are things that I don't know. I think what Carlos was saying and what I have been thinking about all of this, and in the over the last year,
Bueno,
is how, in one way, how much more we learn from those patients that we feel we haven't made a sufficient connection with than those we have. Now, I don't think this is a generalization. It just so happens that in some kind of way, for instance, my compulsiveness in trying to understand something that happened a long time ago and that I still don't understand means I continue to be interested in the area. It's not like the contentment or the more or less satisfaction of those analyses that you feel have been good enough. Not incredible. I don't think I've had any incredible analyses, but I've had some that have been good enough. And people have left, and then they've had some kind of contact with me perhaps over the years. You feel you've done an all right job. And then there are those analyses you feel you haven't. And not from a sense of guilt, I think, but a sense of persistence in thinking about psychoanalytic explanations. I mean, there might be defiance. You know, I'm not going to give up on trying to work this out. I don't know. But anyway, they are some things that have come to mind as a result of your comments. Thank you all.
gracias, Lesley. Ahora, Eliana Montori, vamos a pedir que acerques una pregunta del público.
Could you please bring a question from the audience? Because I don't think we have a lot of time. So that Lesley has the opportunity to answer. Well, we don't have much time. I will read one or two questions. There is one that talks about the additional difficulties in the silence of a patient in remote sessions when we don't have the holding of the physical presence of the analysts and physical elements that we usually have in the session. Another, the psychoanalytic clinic, it's usual to find a close relationship between the silent patient and the sense of abandonment and early maternal depression lived by the patient from your understanding. So we have many questions that we will not be able to raise now, but generally, among the questions, there is great acceptance of the work and the proposal that we have to accept the patient's silence, respect, which doesn't mean that the analyst does not speak, to remind the patient that you are there, and from time to talk about our understanding of the silence, to communicate holding. I had a patient that was silent for 6 months and then started to speak and made a regression to dependence. So I think I have given a general overview of the questions. Unfortunately, we have no more time. They will be, all the questions from the chat will be sent to Lesley, Alfredo, and Monica so that they can think about them and answer them if they wish. Lesley? Muchas gracias.
I think the first question is a question for all of you, for all of us, but I retired last summer, and so I now don't have the opportunity to learn at first hand the opportunities you all have, because I think the question of remote analysis is a pressing one of interest, and the question of silence on the phone or on the screen is also it adds a very different dimension potentially to the work, which even more than silence in the consulting room, I think depends on the kind of transference, countertransference dynamic that there is with each patient. But I think it's a whole new field of inquiry to be investigating. Because one of the things about remote analysis, think of the words remote analysis. And I think one of the reasons we have talked about remote analysis is in a way to signal our disapproval of this kind of analysis, an exception. And now, in a way, until we get back into we are not back in the consulting room in Britain. I imagine you are not in Buenos Aires either. Then the question of our new way of working and what it means and how old questions, silence, words, are inflected differently in a different setting, become increasingly areas for our thoughtful investigation, really. So thank you very much for that question. I think the second question, I agree, was one tends to go back to a very early situation in thinking about silence and abandonment. Thank you.
Les diría a Alfredo y a Mónica.
Alfredo, Mónica, if you would like to say something before I close the meeting. Alfredo, would you like to make a comment and then I make a comment? Yes, Mónica, you can make a comment. I think that I'm sure we have a lot of questions to keep thinking, to keep discussing. I think we have raised many issues. We didn't have enough time to talk about analytic receptivity, that difficult time we analysts encounter ourselves when the analysis doesn't work. I fully agree. It's happened to all of us. It creates we feel pain when they don't work. Some do well and some don't work. The patient, it's good to do with the patient, our own limits, the method. I think there are many issues to be discussed and that bring up, Lesley's paper, silent patients, and a lot more than that. I would highlight analytic receptivity. Thank you, Alfredo. I would like to make a comment about those analyses that you consider a failure. And probably if we had a longer follow-up, it could be they were not such a failure as we assumed. It's likely that in this patient, some changes took place. That in the abrupt end, prevented the seeing them, could not make them visible. I remember in my first times before practicing psychoanalysis alone, a case of hypnosis in a patient that when she was presented in society had a hysterical brachial paralysis. It was an emergency, and I would practice hypnosis, sessions of hypnosis, and in one of the sessions she could move her arm, and at the end of the session she would go back to the paralysis. After that week, I had the feeling of failure, the absolute failure that she had suffered during her party to be introduced in society. And then I found a relative that said, we forgot to thank you because she participated very well of the party. And she never again had a problem in her arm. So sometimes it's not you that find out about the changes that took place, but they also take place. Because at the end of an analysis, moreover than in psychotherapy, the analyst is not the same, the patient is not the same, whatever may happen. The analysis does not fix all the problems and all the conflicts. That's unthinkable. But psychoanalysis, many times, and this patient had the only attentive listening she had experienced in her life. And at one point that was useful, who knows? So I would not be so pessimistic about the evaluation of what happened with this patient. And I do recall Winnicott used to say that patients took long to know what the analyst is useful for. When they realized that the analyst was not useful for what they needed, well, it was painful to get to detach from the analyst, to get rid of the analyst. There must have been a deeper bond than it seemed. And in order to get away, she had to make her suffer a year of silence. There was something else among them that prevented her from saying from the very beginning, I'm leaving. I think she continued trying to get rid of her and could not. I don't know, it's something to think about. What is success, what is failure in analysis, something we have to think about one day. Because all sessions, there's round sessions where I say one thing and the patient answers, in actual practice do not exist. So I don't know, I wouldn't get despair with this patient. Maybe she did not do so badly afterwards. Well, thank you, Lesley. Would you like to add something? Lesley, would you like to add something?
No, I agree.
Bueno,
Thank you, Alfredo.
bueno, con mucha alegría. Una gran...
It's been a great satisfaction. We have come to the end of this meeting. We would like to take longer, but for this, we cannot control time. We wish to thank all those who made it possible. First of all, CAP staff for offering the possibility to hold it. Lesley for the kindness to show her work, to see her in the consulting room with her patient, permitting us to share her experience, to be able to think about this complex issue in our clinic. Dr. Alfredo Paiseira and Monica Cardenal for their interesting comments and participation, and to all of you, dear colleagues from all over the world, for being here with us. In the difficult present situation that we have encountered new ways of communication through virtual means, thanks to the creativity that we all have, that has been reflected in so many activities we can join from our homes and maintain us in our daily work. Let's keep together. Thank you. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you all very much.
Muchas gracias.